Okay, so it is 3 o'clock to 3:30, and it's time to open things up for discussions. I do have a list of questions that have been asked by our audience members, who I hope are still here if you asked the question. And I think I'd like to kind of prioritize some of those because we haven't heard much from the audience. So let me start with one that came from Shankar Iyer, who's been a student at ours at Arihanta for a while. We've all seen him in many of our classes. And this is Shankar's question. And I know Dr. Long already answered this question in the chat, but I thought it was still important enough that we bring it back up and see if we wanted to sort of pass it around a little bit because I thought it was provocative. So in the last couple of talks, we have heard how Jains have used shared terminology to afford maximum value, I think he's quoting me there, to other traditions and to understand interlocutors by their own self-definition. I think that sort of resonates with what Steve Ost was just saying too. Assuming that there were rather few Buddhists left in India by Yashoda Vijay's time, the historical moment, what do you think were his motivations for using Buddhist terminologies in his work? And then he says, to elaborate a bit more on my question, I've heard that Jain libraries were responsible for preserving a lot of Buddhist literature in India after professed Buddhism had waned. Perhaps Yashoda Vijay's usage of Buddhist terminology is a reflection of that continued story, or more generally, of a respect for an interlocutor, even in that interlocutor's absence. And I guess I would also mention Thilo's conversation with how the Buddhists were showing up how the Jains were showing up at the Buddhist mindfulness. I know operating in Jain communities, I've often been told that Jain kids, when they go to school, when people ask what religion they are, they say Jain, the answer is, what's that? And they say it's like Buddhism. And I've always been like, well, actually, it's kind of not at all like Buddhism, as Thilo mentioned. There's Atman and Anatman. I mean, so anyway, does anybody want to mention anything about, I guess, as Steve Ost might call it, the historical moment of Yashoda Vijay's time and how he is dealing with the Buddhist interlocutors? And I see Jeff Long's hand just went up as well there.
Oh, this will be really quick because Anil Mundra also wrote this in the chat, and I just think it's worth underscoring, which is a lot of the texts, a lot of Jain texts, and especially Shovijaya's, many of his texts are commentaries, in some cases commentaries on commentaries on commentaries on root texts that were written when Buddhism was still very much there. And so by necessity, they end up elaborating on, arguments with Buddhists. But I think there's a deeper part of your question about that particular historical moment. And so I've already written and said stuff, so I'm going to leave that for others.
You could reiterate, too, if you wanted to. Okay, does anybody else want to talk about Yashoda Vijay's historical moment and how that relates to Buddhists?
Yeah, I can build on that a bit, if you want.
Yes,
so, yes. Anil, thank you so much for the... Can you read Anil's explanation? Because, yeah, as Long just summarized, like these conversations were coming from previous conversations, and actually, as I've been studying Yashoda Vijaya, sometimes he's literally copying from the previous Jain authors. So it's like dialogues and conversations that have been going on. But then, if we think about the environment of Yashoda Vijaya, as Dr. Vos was explaining, it was a very, for example, he lived for many years in Varanasi, and it was a very cosmopolitan environment. And he was kind of living with other thinkers, other monks at that time. As Dr. Vos also explained, at that moment, there were translations projects into Arabic, into Persian. Some of the Brahmanical literature was also being translated, not only the Jain literature. So, of course, the moment he was living is very important. This is something I'm going to look further in my dissertation. I've already studied, but not as much as I would like. And then I wanted to add something more about these questions that have been posted here. So in my talk, particularly about this issue of the 4 bhavanas, so, and also in my chapter, so I was not even feeling comfortable calling them Buddhist or even Jain, or because first of all, if we look to the Sanskrit, the Sanskrit is Maitri Mudita Upeksha and Karuna. The Buddhist, the Pali is slightly different. It's Metta Mudita Upekha and Karuna, and the Jains sometimes they change two of them, as I've shown you. So I didn't, yeah, and also in the Upanishads we in some more older Upanishads than the Jain text that I was looking, we find also the Sanskrit, the same Sanskrit that the Buddhists were using. So when I was reading all this and trying to put it in my chapter, I remember some of these important reflections that John Cord and also Dundas made in some of the most well-known books, and they remind us that we should think sometimes about these traditions as South Asian, not just. So I would think that in the particular case of the four bhavanas, I'm calling them the four bhavanas because some of the modern authors, they have used this, but for me, they are pointing out to some maybe shared practice that I'm not sure who's borrowing from who at this point. Maybe later, and if you have something to share, you can tell me, please. And then something else I wanted to say about Yashvi Jaya is that, well, he wrote in 4 languages as far as we know, in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Gujarati, and Hindi. So in a sense, for me, I do think that this is at least some kind of an indicator that he wanted to reach speakers of those languages. But at the same time, I have here I was checking some of in the Brill's Encyclopedia of Jainism that was published recently. There is a chapter by Andrew Moore that he reminds us that we can only speculate. Just let me read 2 sentences because I try to keep these sentences in mind when I'm reading this text, not to decontextualize them or something like that. So he says, we can only speculate about how the Jains may have used their text. Perhaps Jain monks recited the stories of gathering of lay Jains. He's talking here about lay Jains as a form of instruction, but I think it also applies to other kind of texts sometimes. And he keeps on saying, it is also unclear how the texts have influenced Jain life throughout the centuries. And then he keeps on going. So yeah, for me, it was kind of challenging, and I came up with the best conclusions that I could, but I would appreciate further insights. And then the last thing I wanted to say, sorry. Okay, and the last thing just is more in regard to the context, that I think there is so much to unpack there. And one of the reasons is because Yashvi Vijaya wrote in these 4 languages, and most of his texts have not been translated into English. So there is so much that remains to be done. So we have work ahead.
Hey, you hear that? Everybody get to work. All right. Thank you very much, Alba. That was a really, really comprehensive and important response. Thank you. Okay, so I have another question, unless somebody else wants to speak more on that. Okay, I have another question from Rajmani Chaitanya Prakash. He's asked, can you please explain the various components of Jain yoga beyond physical postures? I think he's sort of alluding to some of this decontextualization of modern Jain yoga. Will Jain yoga include mantra chanting, music, some spiritual kirtans, and song recitations? So I'm sure pretty much anybody on this panel would be eager to answer that question. Does anybody want to discuss that? I think this really is alluding to the decontextualization that Thilo and Steve were speaking about. So Rajmani, Chaitanya Prakash, if you didn't catch the answer from our last 2 speakers, it's very problematic to reduce Jain yoga to physical postures. It's problematic to reduce Jain yoga to just meditation, even though those may be important aspects of the Jain yoga tradition. It's important that we don't redefine it in such a way that excludes the traditional Jain yoga, which very much would have all of the practices that you mentioned. In our book, The Contemplative Studies, we have a lot of social science there that describes the pujas to gurus, their singing, all of that occurs. Pragya Jain herself, I happen to know, is an excellent singer. as a Jain. So the kirtans and the singing and the music. We also heard the story of Kapila dancing. Is a form of becoming a Kevala dancing, right? We heard from Venu Mehta, which very much problematizes a mutually exclusive binary. I think that's kind of one of the themes that Steve Vos was talking about a little bit here. It's not either bhakti or jnana. It's not either embodied or soul. That sort of either or dialectic. The Jain epistemology is nothing if it's not a resistance to mutually imposed false illicit disjunctions and false binaries. I mean, that's what Anikantavad really is a movement towards a dialectical logic. And the critique of Ekanta is when somebody falsely imposes an illicit disjunction, right? So that's really what it is. The emphasis on eternality too much for Nyaya Visheshika Yoga Sankhya versus the influence too much on flux for the Buddhists. They're all positing a false binary, a false dichotomy. Whereas the Jain impulse towards dialectic, both and, that we see with the Syattvada and the Saptabhangi there, that is very much more akin. So I think when we're looking at Jain yoga practices, we shouldn't have those same sort of false binaries, because then we're not thinking like Jains, right? We're thinking with illicit disjunctions. It's not either jnana or bhakti. It's not either body or soul. It's not either desire or no desire. It's not either pravritti or nivritti. Those are, all of those sort of juxtapositions and dialectics came up in our talk. So I think Chaitanya Prakash, I think that would answer that question as well, too. So it all has a place. And I see Dr. Long has more to say about that.
Just a little bit, just to underscore what you're saying by an example. In Yashovijaya's Gyanasara, even though he does posit a progression from what we would today call outer to inner, at no point does one give up the outer practices, right? It's not the case that you are progressing in the sense that, okay, now I no longer need to chant, I no longer need to sit in a particular way. You continue doing all of that, even as you're cultivating this anandamana experience. So yeah, that's precisely right.
Right. Thank you for that excellent comment, Rajmani. I know it's late at night. He's down there in Chennai, so I don't know if he stayed up all night to hear the answer to this. If anybody else has anything to say, Parveenji, did you want to address that as well?
Thank you, Kodanji. I've been hesitant to say anything among this esteemed scholars, but I think a few questions have come up, so I just wanted to talk about it, particularly in our question answers. I saw a question or comment about the yoga practice that we are seeing, commercialized yoga practice that we are seeing. I mean, they used a word that I don't want to repeat here, but I think the key thing is we got to look at the yoga that has been commercialized in the Western world, or even India now, is just a preamble to the actual yoga practice. If you really look at that, that's preparing your body to get into a situation where you can really get into what, from my understanding, what Jains want to achieve out of yoga. Yoga, by definition, is union. But at the same time, I think Steve pointed out, it takes us into disunion as well, because while we are connecting with ourselves through yoga, we are disconnecting with the mundane worldly affairs as well. So it works both ways. But the process that Jain yoga takes us, and it's a real process. It's not something disjointed, it's very well structured process. Jain yoga takes us through physical exercises, but essentially it wants to take us to meditation, contemplation, and then go higher and higher in consciousness development, so we get to the stage where we really get in touch with ourselves, which is our soul. I think this what I've heard today, this is an area I think we need to spend more time on that. I think really bring it out, the salient aspects of Jain yoga, and these are very critical aspects that all of us need to understand, the world needs to understand.
Yeah, these are great points too, Parveen G. And I'm glad that you mentioned the comment there. Yeah, there's a word that I wouldn't repeat publicly either, but it is still an important point. Maybe I will say it but he asked, and I'm not going to delete the comment because it was a good comment, despite what may not be the best language choice. But this is perhaps not the context of the workshop, but I did not hear anything about the popular yoga in the West. I'm going to go ahead and say it. Forgive me, plug your ears if you're adverse to harsh language. He says what is called the bastardization of yoga. Obviously problematic terminology, but would anybody care to comment on that? And then there was another comment in that same vein. This was perhaps not the context of this workshop. This one's anonymous, but I did not hear any. Oh, that is the same comment. Oh wait, did I get it wrong? Let me see. I think there was one.
Yep. It's the same chain of
it's
thoughts.
the same chain of comments.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think something which maybe should be said about modern Western yoga. I think this speaks to Thilo's sort of framing how the modern Jain yoga movement itself is increasingly structured like global capitalism, which seems to be inherently problematic. But then if we also think about the bankrolling of the Mughal Empire on the part of Jains, maybe there's a history of capitalism there that is not completely untraditional. So I think something might need to be said about the intersection between the modern transnational yoga, postural-based yoga movement, modern Jain yoga, and how that may be problematic. And I think I saw Dr. Long raise his hand on that point.
Which very, very briefly, I think the very fact that we had such a long and rich conference without bringing up this topic itself shows that there's much more to this topic than what often pops into contemporary people's minds when they hear the word yoga.
Good point.
Such a great point. Such a great. Okay, Thilo, I think you had a lot to say that related to this.
Yeah, well, just shortly replying to this comment, I think both yoga, postural yoga as it's practiced in Western countries nowadays, and all these various contemporary Jain yoga traditions, they stand within the same genealogy. They have the same history of 100 years, and they are both products of a East-West exchange which went back and forth various times, and there's multiple moments within that development that have been well described by scholars like late 19th, early 20th century Indians picked up yoga as something that actually had a function within the independence struggle, like the physical exercise element, which would make a stronger nation, and these kinds of things can be found in the discourse of Vivekananda or people contemporary to him and to later. And early Postural yoga was influenced by Western workout and like wrestling contexts also. So both Eastern and Western yoga nowadays are the product of the same exchange between the East and the West since more than a century. So we can rhetorically oppose them, but they're actually structurally very similar too.
Yeah, great point. And Steve Vos is eager to mention something on that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for my current research that I'm doing on some contemporary Jain movements, I think the sort of the Eastern Western sort of dichotomy has broken down in ways in which I think we need to start using the phrase transnational or the term transnational, and really start to think about how it is that there are organizations that are based in India that are largely appealing to diaspora audiences, and that are selling a certain kind of a cosmopolitan view of yoga, Jain practices, meet your maker, meet your heritage, kinds of things. And so, yeah, saying that this is sort of, it's definitely bidirectional now. So yeah, and I would just say, if you want to talk about the bastardization of yoga, like there's a good number of sort of folks in India that are doing things like how to do yoga in the back of your car in between meetings while your driver is sort of taking you across town. Like, who knows? So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't sort of like put it on like anyone's sort of lay it at anyone's feet just yet, but to say that, yeah, there are ways that the understanding of how to make Jainism appealing to a modern audience has often led to sort of how do you use Jain principles to cope with your middle class job in modern day capitalism. And so that's not necessarily wrong or bad. I mean, this is sort of the world that we live in, but it is also like, yeah, like how do we sort of instrumentalize Jain yoga practices or any kind of yoga practices so that we can do something else with them other than sort of focus on the moksha idea?
I think that we keep kind of dancing around this point. I hear so many resonance with the critiques of modern mindfulness movement as well too. You know, one of the main critiques is that it enables global capitalism. I mean, if mindfulness is supposed to be about like healthy, then really what it's doing is just making it so people are better workers. I mean, is that really actually contributing to their health? Like, how do you become more peaceful when you're in an abusive environment? Is that really what we want to reduce, you know, mindfulness and yoga? And I received a master's degree in Buddhist studies, and a big field of study was secular Buddhism. And I just scratched my head at this. And then how it would, the mindfulness movement fed into that. We've used the term medicalization in this context. And sometimes I take pause at this because on the one hand, yeah, it's good. We can incorporate modern, epistemes. But at what point are we redefining traditions and contributing to their erasure? And I think that is really the question. So when does a tradition start? How do we define what's traditional and therefore valid and therefore authentic versus what is modern and is therefore not valid and not authentic? Again, I would say be caution of the false binary, but there is certainly a point where our emphasis on a modern interpretation can erase the traditional. And I think we've had that caveat in multiple ways too. Venu Mehta, I see, has something to add here. Please.
Thank you, Bhai. I think I'm thinking about Parveenji's point about, and also Dr. Bose's point about that, how Jain yoga can be useful when we think about modern and popular use of yoga as it comes from India /Hindu nationalism. And I see development of yoga thing as come out as projection from India in 3 stages now. The first one was that Patanjali guy, Ramdev Baba, makes it accessible to the mass, giving it a new face that it's no more just a yogic hidden practice done in isolation, but can be done in like 20,000 audiences doing it at the 5 a.m. at some Ram Leela Maidan in Delhi. And then lots of CDs are coming out. And so he's like basically transforming the entire idea of yoga from textbook to completely, physical bodily practices for good health. The second stage was that, and many people have missed this, like noticing, because it's not been really created any political commentaries, but Narendra Modi's projection of Yoga Day, declaring somewhere in June or July, I forgot the day because I don't observe that, but he's declaring that, and it's bringing back that, okay, India is claiming back the yoga thing. And India is making a face that we are the authentic, authoritative agency of yoga. And the third stage, which I'm seeing as in Indian, who is very highly connected to social media from Indian handles, that yoga has become a kind of a product of social media influencer now in India. It's no more very yogic practice. Anybody who is doing some yoga practices, it's have more than 60, 70,000 subscribers and in 15-second teaching yoga for your eyes and face yoga is booming a lot. So amid this all changes, it's very important for us now to really establish how we want to talk about Jain yoga, because it's a kind of a perfect time.
Yeah, this is important. So, I think that appropriation is a word that surprisingly hasn't come up appropriating yoga to reinforce other structures of power. Perhaps Modi's Yoga Day is not necessarily a way of sort of standing up to colonialism, but I mean, maybe it is that. I mean, maybe it is standing up against the appropriation of yoga by the West and sort of a reasserting of Indians' sort of cultural heritage, Indian ownership, Indian cultural sovereignty over yoga. And that may be very important.
Absolutely, yeah.
But on the other hand, is he just appropriating it for some Hindutva sort of nationalism? Is he making it for his own? So who's benefiting from these dialogues? What does the discourse mean in the cultural moment? I think is
and we also have to see that, like, when he declared Yoga Day on one particular year in one particular, but before that, he started like, okay, all the schools on this particular day will come together, and he would lead one yoga session. And what he's talking to the world by doing that he's uniting India, presenting it to the world, using yoga as an apparatus. So, like, what language is talking to the world? It's something really essential to think about.
When it's all of the above that you have talked and Kojan has talked, it's political move. I don't think it has anything to do with spirituality. One thing I would submit, if everybody sees the value, yoga is the word. Okay, yoga is what it means in terms of union. And one of the westernization results of the word is that we call it yoga, just like we call Rama, just like we call Mahavira. Something for the scholars to think about.
Actually, Parveenji, those are Hindi pronunciations of those words, and if you were taught Sanskrit, you call it yoga, and it's
really
okay. Yoga, yogam, I mean, but I'm asked this question a lot, and someone even posted it. But this is not a East-West thing; it's a Sanskrit Hindi thing.
No,
which might be East-West too. It might have a component to that because we in the West approach South Asia through Sanskrit generally, right? And then, of course, there's a lot of increasing discussion how we may have disempowered vernaculars in the process of that, which is why everybody should study Gujarati or Hindi. Sorry, Vani, but I did say that for you. So I think it's important. My general thing is that if I get corrected on my pronunciation from somebody from South Asian heritage, I usually just accept the critique, even if it's a Bengali pronunciation of whatever. But yeah, I think it's an important conversation. But I'd say it's not wrong. But it also might be, as Westerners, we might, if we get corrected in that, we might want to stop and think, is our exclusive use of Sanskrit itself a form of hegemony?
That's a fair point. Totally fair point.
I understand the point, Jeffrey and Kojan. I get it.
Alba.
It ends at in Sanskrit, but in Western cultures it becomes It's only about short and long So it's yoga, not yoga, but it's yoga.
And then, of course, there's actual incorrect pronunciation too. Yeah. And the most common letter mispronounced is the to particularly if you're, I think, East Coast. But then West Coast, we have our own little problems with pronunciation. Everybody has a different.
That's right.
And I like to try to be accepting on accents as well too, because I would never correct somebody's beautiful Spanish accent, But that being said, there is a certain point where, yeah.
Well, and it is a fair point. I mean, that difference between and ah. I mean, my students have a hard time hearing it. They have a hard time hearing aspirated sounds too. And dental sounds. I mean, these are the things that they can't hear, and then they have a hard time reproducing. And I think what I really appreciate about what Kojan said is that when even if you're like me and you start getting into an argument about Sanskrit and Hindi and so on, there has to be an attitude of humility, right? It can't be this kind of we're here to tell you about who you are, and so I fully agree. In fact. On the advice of a good friend in the community, often when I give talks to Jain groups, I won't say Anekantavad. I'll say Anekantavad. That is good because that's the term people know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yep. Okay.
we've had those issues with editing books too. Which terms do we, because a lot of times I just want to Sanskritize everything because it's most recognizable. But then again, at what point does that become its own form of hegemony? So these are also good questions. I love linguistic conversations. I can have. I believe we're running, we're just about 6 minutes over time. I've really enjoyed this conversation a lot. And I think that there was another question about how yoga is so associated with asanas and breathing techniques, and whether breathing in asana has a place in Jain yoga. I think that's been answered by a lot of our section on embodied yoga. We've had multiple different presentations that showed Kayotsarg. Pranayama is being both advocated by the Yoga-śāstra, but also a caution against it. I mentioned that, and so, there was also another mention of that. So I think that we should probably wrap up here and start to end the conference, because I do really like punctuality in general.